Welcome to Tech in the Right Direction, the podcast. Let's take tech in the right direction to drive social change and close the employment, pay, and culture gap for women in technology. This podcast is focused on helping turn ideas into action to create opportunities for women to advance in the dynamic technology industry. I hope this podcast will inspire and motivate you to encourage more women and girls to seek or grow a career as a woman in technology. Stories about the journey of amazing women in this tech field starts right now. Welcome to Tech in the Right Direction, the podcast. This week, I'll be speaking with Dan Draper. Dan is the CEO and founder of CipherStash, a data storage platform for sensitive data. Their platform uses searchable encryption technology to protect against attacks that leak a snapshot of the entire running system, thereby enabling development teams to search data with high levels of protection without compromising on usability. Dan is a seasoned cryptography engineer whose goal is to equip all developers with the skills they need to create safe applications. He is the executive producer of Debugging Diversity, a film that explores why there are so few women in technology, as well as what might be done to change it. Welcome to the show, Dan. I'm so excited to have you on.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
Sure. So let's get started. So Dan, I'm so excited to have you on as a Mentors That Make a Difference segment of our show. So thanks so much for being an ally for women in technology. Tell us some more about you.
Well, as you can probably tell by the accent, I'm an Australian, Aussie. I grew up in a city in the south of Australia called Adelaide, and most people probably haven't heard of it, but it's a lovely little city. I now live in Sydney in Australia. I've been in tech really my whole life. My dad was a designer and my mum was an accountant and writer, and they weren't particularly technical, but I discovered computers when I was about 14 and developed a strong passion for it, shall I say, bordering on obsession. I'm now 40 and have been obsessed ever since.
Nice.
But what I found interesting about that as a 14-year-old discovering computers, there weren't very many kids back in those days. I learned to code through books. There was no internet at my school when I was learning to code. But I had a rare opportunity that a few young people back in those days had, but not many, to get into computing at a young age. And it was, in particular, it was mostly boys that had that opportunity. And so I look back on that those times now with a different lens. But it was very interesting at the time, and it certainly started what has become a fruitful career for me. These days, I am the CEO and founder of a company called CipherStash, and we are building what we call a searchable encrypted data vault, which we might cover later in the podcast. Cybersecurity is my interest and my specialty nowadays, but I've worked in all kinds of different areas of technology, leading engineering teams in education, healthcare, recruitment. I've worked in Australia and the US, lived in New York for a while, so I've had a fairly interesting career, I think.
Very, very interesting and great career. I mean, you've gotten in the trenches with coding too, which is so awesome. And we are kind of similar. I started very early with a fascination for technology when I was 15, and it's not gone away. It's really just continued, except you're younger than me. And so I started with punch cards.
Wow.
Coding with punch cards. So yeah, that dates me quite a bit, but it just shows you how far technology has come over the years. It's just amazing.
Indeed. Yeah. I sometimes I have, punch cards to me, it's probably not that much before my time, but it seems like such a difference. But even now I talk to some of my younger colleagues, might only be 10 or 15 years younger than me, and tell them that I didn't have the internet when I first started to learn to code. And they look at me with, blank stares like, what? And it's really been a dramatic change in the last 20 years or so. It's
Yeah,
quite incredible.
I think about my phone. I think about the technology we have today. We couldn't live without it. I mean, we don't know what to do. I mean, everything
Right.
is in my phone, from the camera to my clock to pictures to my credit cards. Everything's there. It's
Exactly.
crazy.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
can't do anything without using technology.
you
You can't
can.
live a normal life without engaging with technology in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think about, the future when I retire, I need to give up that phone and not be so connected to it, but I don't know that that'll happen ever.
Probably not.
Yeah, yeah. So, Dan, this podcast is focused on bridging the employment pay and culture gap for women in technology, and we know technology is a male-dominated field. What are you seeing in the industry today?
Indeed, yeah. I think I should say this. Now that I'm very focused on it, I see things very differently. I'm not sure that I was always fully aware of these challenges. I think that's pretty typical for men in the industry. But what I'm seeing nowadays is a lot of talk. We see a lot of events. We see a lot of articles. There's a lot of news coverage about the lack of diversity in technology. The challenge, I think, is that to an extent, we're sort of preaching to the choir a little bit. I go to a number of events. I'm involved in a group here in Sydney called Demand Championing Change, and it's a group that's it's mostly men, as by the name, come together and talk about how we can play a role in addressing diversity. But it's the same characters that turn up. Wonderful people, and I'm so pleased with the work that they're doing. But we need to spread the message further. We need to get people involved in this discussion that perhaps haven't been aware of these issues or maybe don't see themselves as playing a role. And you lift up a little bit higher for a second and look at women's participation in technology. And I rely very heavily on statistics that come out of various organizations, but one in particular, the National Center for Women and Information Technology, which is run by Lucy Sanders out of UC Boulder in Colorado. And they publish stats on women's participation in the technology workforce every year. And since 2003, that the number hasn't really changed. It still hovers around 24%, 23 to 25%. And that surprises me. I've been sort of becoming aware of these issues for maybe 6 or 7 years now. And in that time, I've seen a lot more discussion, a lot more awareness. And yet those numbers don't seem to be changing. What else is kind of alarming is the gender pay gap doesn't really seem to be changing very much. In Australia, for example, the gender pay gap is roughly 14% across all industries. In technology, or technically, actually, they just describe it as STEM in these reports, but it's 25% in STEM, which is really awful. In the US, it's a little better. It varies from state to state, but it's still roughly around 7%. Gender pay gap in tech. Any pay gap really is unacceptable.
Right.
And one final thing I'll share, which I've become aware of more recently, is there's been quite a lot of research around men's perspectives on gender diversity and the role that they could or should play. And what's interesting, one study that came out of an organization here in Sydney called the Dream Collective, they published some stats, and I'll just give you a couple of them, which I found particularly eyebrow raising, shall we say. Around half of men, actually just over half of the men that were surveyed, said that they feel some level of reverse discrimination now. They feel like that this discussion around gender equality and improving diversity is somehow discriminating against them, which I find mind-boggling personally, and even as a man. And that a third of men feel that solving this problem is somehow a zero-sum game. In other words, they feel that if they're elevating women, that they must somehow suffer. And so I think with all the talk and all the seeming action that's taking place in this space, it's apparent to me that we still have a lot of work to do. And we have a lot of work to do, particularly with the men that maybe fit into that 50% and that 30% group that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I think it's amazing. The stats you put out there are so accurate, and same stats we're hearing, all over the world. And there is this bias. There's an unconscious bias, I think, that men have, that, maybe this reverse discrimination or elevating women makes them lower, they kind of lower their standard, and that's not true. That is not true. We just need us to be equal. That's all.
Absolutely.
That's all we're looking for, right? But it's so interesting that a lot of the problems in not enough women in technology is really on women, which is crazy for me to say as being a woman, but I see women just they lack confidence. And when you lack confidence, you don't see yourself as equal. And so they sometimes put themselves into this situation. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting conundrum. I see. Let me step back a second. Mm-hmm. In my 20 odd years working in engineering, I have never encountered any difference in capabilities between men and women in technology. Mm-hmm. In fact, mm-hmm. some of the very best engineers I've ever worked with have been women. And mm-hmm. I actually don't think gender is correlated to engineering capability in any way whatsoever. But I have noticed one particular difference between men and women, and that is that men seem to, if there's any confidence, they seem to be slightly overconfident, mm-hmm. and women tend to be slightly underconfident, or mm-hmm. not as confident as they could be. And the way that sometimes manifests itself, you've probably heard this or had guests on your podcast that have said something similar. When there's a job advertisement, mm-hmm. and there are maybe 10 criteria that the company is looking for. If a man has 2 or 3 of those criteria and goes, yeah, cool, I'm going to apply for that job. Uh-huh. Often women will not apply unless they've got 8 or 9 of those criteria checked, or maybe
sometimes
even all of them.
10. Yep.
Yeah, exactly, right. Mm-hmm. And I'd heard this before, and I remember experiencing it with my wife a few years back. She works she's not in technology, she works in the entertainment industry, but she saw a job ad, and she came home from work one day and she says, oh, geez, I wish I could apply for this job. This looks really cool. It's like my dream job, but I don't meet all the criteria. And I said, can I have a look? And I looked at the job ad and I said, you can do all of this stuff. I mean, maybe you haven't done this one and haven't done this one before, but I know you can do that. Mm-hmm. And I encouraged her to apply. And guess what? She got the job.
That's awesome.
And I sort of thought, well, now I see, now I understand. And I think one of the things that perhaps we need to do in the industry is maybe in the example of job ads, don't necessarily state very explicit criteria. Don't set a really high bar and say, we will only talk to you if this X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. Have a more open and broad set of expectations. And then, so through the recruitment process or the interview process, start to tease out what the candidates might be interested in doing, what their capabilities really are. Don't let people self-select out. I think you need to give more open opportunities to folks. And then similarly, for the leaders in the organizations that are tackling these kinds of challenges, I think it's incumbent on them, on us, to give people a little nudge in the right direction. Sometimes people will self-select out. Imposter syndrome is a thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes lack of confidence plays a really important role. And people just need a nudge. I mean, I have, just to wrap this thought up, I have one example to share on that front. Mm-hmm. I was the CTO for an organization called Expert 360 a number of years ago, and there was a woman in my team. She actually changed careers. She'd been working for 10 or 15 years, and she decided to come into tech. So she was a little bit older than the sort of typical grads. But she'd been coding or engineering for maybe 3 or 4 years, and I could see she was a very strong engineer, especially for somebody who'd been doing it for a relatively short time, and it had enormous potential. And we were running these meetups once a month, and we were looking for speakers. And I said to her, "Hey, why don't you speak? Why don't you do a talk?" And she says to me, "Oh, but I can't talk about some of this really, hardcore, complicated stuff." And I said, "You don't need to talk about hardcore, complicated stuff. Talk about something that you're passionate about, something that you're working on at the moment." And so I kind of gave her an opportunity to speak, and she put together a talk. She spoke in front of, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 people, and it was incredibly well received. And I remember her coming up to me afterwards with this huge grin on her face saying, "Thank you so much for encouraging me to do that. I had no conception that I could do that. But now that I've done it, I feel like I can do it again." And she did. She kept doing it, and she's had a very fruitful career ever since. And in fact, I'm now very fortunate enough to have been able to hire her again, and she now works in my new company. So it was I think that was a really good example of what I'm trying to get at.
Wow, I want to clone you, Dan, 1,000 times. That's amazing. And you have said everything perfectly. I couldn't have said it any better. I always tell that job story too, and it's so true. I mean, you see it every day, but your words of encouragement gives them confidence to say, wow, somebody believes in me. I can do it, right? And that is so important. Sometimes we just need that nudge, like you said. So
Indeed,
that's awesome. That's awesome. So, being an ally we are just so thankful to you for doing that. What are some of the qualities or the, habits or the qualities, I guess, that we should look for in building allyship? Because we need more allies to give us more of a voice, because a lot of times we're at the table, but we don't have a voice. And so having allies support us and, raise up just an idea to say, oh, Jennifer, I think Jennifer has an idea, and go that way. What are some of the qualities that an ally should have that we should look for?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I do get asked a lot. There are quite a lot of men who want to be allies. I mean, I speak mainly from the perspective of men, because obviously I am one, but also I think I try to be a role model for other men. So consequently, a lot of men do ask me for advice on this topic. So some of the thoughts that I share when I get asked this question, number one is to acknowledge that this is a problem. The funny thing about privilege is that if you've got privilege, you probably don't realize that you've got privilege. If you don't have privilege, that's when it starts to become apparent. It's taken me a long time to realize or to accept that I've got privilege, just being I'm a white straight male.
Right.
And I didn't come from a wealthy family, or I was never particularly fortunate. But I've now had a fruitful career. But I think what's important to note is that none of my successes or failures have had anything to do with my gender, race, or sexuality. And I think getting other people who have privilege to realize or acknowledge that they have privilege, and to acknowledge that there are challenges in our industry surrounding privilege and gender and race is incredibly important. Even just getting them to acknowledge that there is a gender pay gap, you would be amazed, and maybe not, amazed at how many men refuse to believe that there is a gender pay gap. I mean, yeah, I'm sure. I
and
take
it's
it
real.
People are probably very aware of it.
Yeah, and it's real.
Yeah. So that's number one. Just acknowledging that this is a thing, and even if we don't, even if you don't necessarily fully understand it, just believe us. Believe us when we're saying this is a problem.
The awareness. Yep.
Yeah. Number two, speak up. If you see some bad behavior, or there's a colleague or even a boss that's doing something that you think is inappropriate, say something. Sometimes you can say it in a public forum. I fully accept that is an incredibly hard thing to do. So sometimes saying it in a private forum after the fact is almost as good. But do something about it. It's something I've tried to do many times over the years. A very simple one. I had a meeting with a team in a workplace a few years ago, and one of the male team members was, he's very, very gregarious and excited, and he's a good engineer. He's good at what he does, but he absolutely dominated the meeting. I don't think anyone else said a single word. And least of all the 2 or 3 women that were in the meeting. And I pulled him up afterwards, and I said, look, I love how passionate you are about this stuff, and I really admire the energy you have, but you've got to give other people an opportunity to contribute, to speak. Maybe try keeping your mouth shut for the first 5 minutes in the meeting next time. And he sort of looked at me and went, oh my God, you're right. I had no idea. I actually didn't realize.
Right.
So I think sometimes speaking up doesn't have to be confrontational. Sometimes it's really just about helping people see things that they hadn't seen themselves. So speaking up, number 2. Number 3, provide opportunities. I shared that example of my former and now current colleague earlier. Particularly if you are in a leadership position, I think it's a really important role that you can play to help find opportunities for members of your team, particularly those that are typically not as well represented, like women and minorities.
Yep.
And then finally, number 4, once again, particularly if you're in a leadership position, is change systems. What are the kinds of systems that you have in your organization that could be having an effect on women and minorities in your team? So things like hiring practices, and we talked about some of that before. Another great one is things like open salaries. So at CipherStash, for example, we've taken the approach now that we have a fully open and transparent salary plan. We don't publish it outside the company, but everyone inside the company knows what everybody else is on, what level they're on, and we have standard kind of salary levels, not even ranges, but a level for each particular role in the business. And that way it doesn't entirely eliminate the gender pay gap, but it is a really, really important step in addressing in eliminating it, essentially. So things like that can help, and there's all kinds of different systems and processes that we could talk about, but they're sort of the 4 main things that I think a good ally needs to think about.
That's incredible, Dan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is
You're
so
welcome.
amazing. You are hitting all the nails on the head, because this is so near and dear to my heart. And there's nobody who has said it the way you have. And it's just so articulate, and it explains it absolutely correctly. So thank you.
I'm so happy to hear that. Just one other thing I wanted to say before I move on, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off.
No.
I'm thrilled that you said that, but I have to say that it's taken a very long time to understand this, and I certainly was not comfortable with this stuff for a long time. And I'm very fortunate that I've had some wonderful mentors. But what I wanted to say to any other men that might be listening, or women who could perhaps pass this message on, is that if you don't understand this stuff, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes, but I think we all just need you to try. Start to try and learn this stuff. Yeah.
So true, because it doesn't come innately for a lot of people. There are unconscious biases, like I said before. People don't even know they had it. The man who was speaking and not thinking of anybody else to speak wasn't intentionally doing it. He was just passionate, and he was just out there saying what he was thinking. But when you brought it to his attention, that awareness says, wow, I didn't even know that, right? So now I'm going to be better. And so we all learn step by step. There's no right or wrong. You have to fall. You have to learn step by step. And it might take a long time, and that's really okay. We can do it one step at a time, and we don't have to make big strides to make these changes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your business. Your expertise is in data security. Share with us why data security is more crucial now than ever before.
Yeah.
Because everybody's talking about, security, pretty
Right.
much. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where you can't do anything without using technology in some way or another. And the way that I think about it, I mean, every time you buy something online, you buy a pair of jeans, or you make an appointment to see a doctor, or apply for a loan, or process an insurance claim. Every time you do one of those things, you're giving some of your probably sensitive and certainly personal data to another company. And I actually had a report done recently by a company called Mine, that helped me understand how many organizations I had actually given data to. And it's something like 1,100 different organizations.
Wow.
And then if you look at some of the data security statistics, say for example in the US, roughly one in two, so 50% of companies will suffer a data breach at some point in the next 5 years. And all you got to do is multiply those two numbers out. 1,100, or let's say 1,200 companies and 50%. That's 600 companies are going to lose my data at some point.
Mm.
That is terrifying, quite frankly.
That is terrifying.
So I wanted to find solutions to that problem. And I mean, it's an enormous problem. It's probably equal in magnitude to the diversity problem. It's another huge problem facing our industry. And I hope to play a small part in its solution.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That is very, very frightening. I've heard also similar statistics, and it just, where we are using our phones and doing banking and doing credit card stuff all over. And a lot of people don't think about the security piece of it. And you need to think, we're on Wi-Fi everywhere, and you're not even thinking about, okay, what am I putting on this Wi-Fi connection that could be hacked somehow? So it's really interesting.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I
and
bet you're
I think
careful, right?
yes, exactly. What I also find really interesting about this problem is that, once again, developers are kind of at the heart of this problem. Developers are the ones that build the technology that stores this data, or builds the applications that sits on top of the data infrastructure. So I think the other sort of really big issue that we're facing in this regard is, how do we help developers become more security aware, better security engineers, I suppose you could say. How do we give them the tools or the education to make sure that the applications they're building are taking good care of our data? And that's a huge challenge.
Now, I run a IT training business, and so we do skill IT pros on security, and security as part of different pieces of technology. So it's starting to come out more and more, and it's becoming a very, very hot topic. But the skills to do that is also critical. Like you said, developers have to think of that first as they're building. Before, they were thinking of the business application and building it based on that, not thinking about security. Now they have to build it based on the business application and the security piece. So it is very important for them to understand the bigger picture as to how dangerous it can be if somebody grabs your data, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of this needs to come from, from the business. I think developers, we're always working to build products that are easy to use, have great user experience. They are performant. They're snappy and responsive. Hopefully, developers are thinking about accessibility and making it available to everybody, but probably not typically thinking enough about security. And I think part of it is because that hasn't been a business priority. If it's not something the business cares about deeply, then it's probably not going to become a huge priority for the organization, or for the team. conversely, I think even when businesses do make this an imperative, say we need to make sure that our data is secure, developers don't necessarily know how to do that effectively. But there's also this tension between, you might have a product manager saying, okay, we've got a shipping date, we've got to get this stuff out, we've got to get it done. You've got customers demanding more features, and there's this little voice in the background, maybe it's the chief information security officer, and she's saying, okay, team, we've got to get this security under control, but with all these competing pressures, it's sometimes not straightforward, and often security is the one that loses out.
And then you find out the hard way, right?
Right, exactly.
What you don't want.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is crazy. Well, you're in the right business. I will tell you, we need that help constantly. So I know we've talked a lot about diversity and inclusion, and especially in the tech space, but I want to know more about debugging diversity. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so debugging diversity was it was kind of an accident for me, if I'm completely honest. A friend of mine and I were making YouTube videos about the tech industry way back in 2014, and we were talking about things like pair programming and testing and fairly technical topics. And we decided we wanted to do something about the people in our industry. And my friend said to me, "Oh, why don't we do a YouTube video about why there aren't many women in tech?" And I sort of looked at him and said, "Oh yeah, that's interesting, because I've always kind of wondered why there aren't more women in tech." And oh, how naive we were. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. But it became, as I learned more about this topic, I realized how important it is, how big a topic it is, and also how challenging it is and continues to be to solve. And what started out as really was going to be a short YouTube video turned into a feature-length documentary, and that also then turned into a series, a docu-series. Wow. And so Debugging Diversity is now a 3-part series. We realized that a feature-length documentary it didn't give us enough latitude to sort of explore other topics over time. So the 3 episodes that we've created, the first one is actually available already. You can watch it now at debuggingdiversity.com via Vimeo on demand. The second 2 episodes are still in production. Episode 1 is called Nerd.exe, and it essentially explores. We talk a little bit about the history of women in tech and the lack of diversity, but really we wanted Debugging Diversity to be about what actions we can take. So we talk a lot about gender stereotypes. We interviewed Lucy Sanders from the National Center for Women and Technology. We interviewed Michelle Glauser, who led the I Look Like an Engineer campaign. There's some really interesting stories in there. And one thing I often say when people ask me about Debugging Diversity is this show, although I hope it's interesting and appealing to women, I actually made it for men. And it sort of goes back to what we were talking about before with this sort of echo chamber. Let's be honest, women are not the ones we need to convince that there's a gender problem in tech.
That's true.
It's the men. Admittedly, not all men. I don't like saying it like that, but a lot of men are quite sympathetic and understand that this problem. But even then, they don't quite know exactly what they need to do. Right. How can they help? And then of course there's the cohort of men who don't even know that it's a problem or don't believe that it's a problem. So there's an element of trying to convince them as well. Episodes 2 and 3. Episode 2 covers sort of some of the challenges in our education, how we can teach children more effectively what computing is and how it can be used. The idea of getting into technology later in your career. And then episode 3 goes into some of the really challenging topics around gender roles and stay-at-home dads and workplace cultural things. And there's some interesting stories in there and some pretty confronting stuff. But I hope that the lessons will be very clear and valuable to the men and women who watch it.
Thank you for putting that together. I can't wait to go and see the first part of the series. And I love that you've put so much work and time into this, because I think the education part is so important, because what you don't know, you don't know. So the more you can be aware, the more you can question yourself and say, am I in the right place? Am I thinking of this correctly? Am I aware that this is a problem? So very, very, very good work. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah.
All right.
It's imperative that we do this. It's imperative for our industry, and it's imperative for society, in my opinion. So,
yes. I keep saying I want to clone you 1,000 times. So, is there a lesson learned, or the one thing that you wish you had known when you began your career that you found out now? And maybe it's the diversity thing, but just a lesson learned or a best practice that you thought, wow, if I learned this sooner, it would have been so much better.
Yeah. I was thinking about this earlier, actually. There's probably lots of things, but the one thing that really struck out to me when I was reflecting on this is it's okay to be vulnerable. I don't think I ever really felt that in my early career. And I know I think a lot of men in particular struggle with that idea that it's okay to be vulnerable. Men are often told that it's not okay to be vulnerable. It's not okay to cry. It's not okay to, say that you're afraid or anxious or sad or anything like that. And yet, I think as a leader, the times that I've been vulnerable with my team or my direct reports has helped us forge a bond that I didn't think was possible in a kind of work context. It's helped me become a better leader, but it's also helped me build stronger bonds with my team. That I don't know all the answers, that I maybe am feeling a little anxious or afraid about the amount of work that we have to do or the particular problem that we have to solve. I wish that I knew that when I was younger, and I wish that more people would realize that as well. So that's probably that's my answer.
I love that. And, I'm still learning to be more vulnerable. It's not easy, because you feel like you want to say the right things and know everything and, be that leader that people respect. But sometimes it is okay to say, I don't know, and be humble and vulnerable to say, I'm human. We'll learn together,
Right.
So, yeah.
And especially developers are always smart. And I think they can see through it when you don't know the answer. If you pretend to know the answer and they go, I don't know about this, and that's when you lose trust, you lose faith.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. So, who are the 3 people that come to mind who have been the most influential to you?
I should say my mum and dad, but I think that probably goes without saying. They've had a big influence on my life. But I would say, going right back to the early days, my 5th grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Stevens, and she saw something in me that I guess nobody else saw at that time. I grew up in a country town. It was it wasn't a poor district, but it certainly wasn't an affluent district. And I think that she kind of took me under her wing and helped me really thrive as a young kid. I think
In what way?
I was really into writing. And this would be sort of before I discovered computers, and I was teased quite a lot as a kid because I was interested in things that most kids weren't. I wanted to write stories and poems and stuff like that, whereas
awesome.
most of the other boys wanted to go and play football. Australia, it's Australian football rules. It's
Right.
that's what they do. And I was never interested in that stuff. I got into sport and things like that later on, but I think having her really sort of foster my interest and support me and help me realize that was totally okay to be interested in those kind of things was incredibly powerful to me. And I didn't realize it until the time. I don't even think I realized it until much later in my life, but that she was incredibly important in my development, I think.
That's awesome.
I have to say my wife. I know that sounds like a cop out, but she is my co-founder in a way. She runs her own business. She's a musician. She works in the entertainment industry, and I started CipherStash on my own, but I see her in many ways as my co-founder. She's the person that's there when I'm having a tough time, or I'm stressed out, or she can be a muse to bounce ideas off me. And I like to think that I'm the same for her. But she's incredibly influential in my life. And then the final one, this was a guy called Mel, who is probably not going to listen to this podcast, but maybe he should. He's about 10 years older than me, and in my early career, he introduced me to Linux, Linux operating system, and the community behind that, open source software, and a number of the technologies like that I continue to use today, like PostgreSQL, the database, for example. He introduced me to that whole world, and that it honestly changed my career. I've become an open source advocate, and I have been involved in that ecosystem for many years. And I'd never even heard of open source software before I met him, and I credit him with an enormous I credit him enormously for my career. Really, he was such a strong influence for me. So those three
Up a
people.
whole new world for you. Yep.
Yeah. Totally.
No, that's amazing. That's great. I love those examples, and I think your fifth grade teacher, your wife, and Mel all are very, very proud of who you've become because you're amazing. You're amazing. All right. So in closing, I could talk to you forever, I think, but I think we have to close soon. So in closing, what advice would you give to a woman considering a career in the tech industry?
Quite simply, do it. It's not easy. It does take a while to become a competent software engineer. Like I say, it usually takes 2 or 3 years before you start to feel like you have some idea what you're doing. Everybody goes through that. And even when you've been doing it for 20 years, sometimes you still feel like you're a beginner. But it is a superpower.
That's the good part of it, because you're challenged, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was the CTO at my last role, I didn't really write a lot of code. I was mostly sort of doing management type stuff, leading the team and strategy and things. And then of course, when I went and started CipherStash, in the first few months, I was the only employee. It was just me, and I was writing code, 8 hours a day, and I had to kind of get back up to speed and learn some new technologies that I hadn't used before. And it was quite challenging, but I loved every second of it. It was so rewarding. I think everybody that pursues a career in technology has a similar experience. But at the end of the day, for me, what it comes down to is it's the ability to not just consume technology, it's the ability to create technology. Jennifer, I'm going to say that again because my computer beeped in the background. Okay. It's the ability to create technology and not just consume technology. We're all consumers of technology, but to be able to build the products and build the systems and technology that we all use is an incredibly powerful and rewarding thing.
It sure is. Wow. And that's the amazing part of technology. You have all different roles, so when women are looking out there for a career in technology, it doesn't have to be coding. It can be anything. There's a lot of different roles within technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so. And technology is such an incredibly creative pursuit. I mean, you could be a product manager or a designer or a data scientist or a systems administrator,
Right.
network engineer, a security penetration tester. There's all kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's a very broad and interesting field.
Well, great advice. So thank you, Dan. I don't know how much I want to thank you. I want to keep saying it over and over again because you've been incredible. I think this is a show that, will get a lot of listens and really will inspire women out there and allies out there to grow more women into technology. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Can you share with our listeners how they can get a hold of you?
Absolutely. So if you want to check out Debugging Diversity, you can go to debuggingdiversity.com. If you're interested in learning more about searchable encryption technology, you can check out CipherStash. That's CipherStash.com. And I'm pretty active on Twitter if you want to follow me at Daniel Draper. Very simple.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I hope it was valuable and interesting, and I'm looking forward to listening to more episodes in the future.
Very much so, and I hope to have you on a future show.
Love to. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Tech in the Right Direction. Please take a minute to subscribe or follow so that you never miss an episode. Also, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Thank you. See you next week.
From IT skill enhancements to end-user adoption training, Directions Training is your resource to help optimize the effectiveness of your technology investments. Over 500,000 students have taken advantage of our wide selection of technology and business training solutions, covering the most popular applications today, such as Microsoft 365, Azure, Windows 10, and more. As a podcast listener, we invite you to take advantage of an exclusive offer. Receive 30 days of free access to our Microsoft official curriculum on-demand courses for IT professionals or end users. Visit us at www.directionstraining.com/podcast to claim this offer today. Hurry, this offer is only available for a limited time. Success is a journey. Ask for directions.